Rahmanir Rahim. Today we will go over some things which previously we did not cover. Previously, for those who did not attend, we covered the traditional arguments for the existence of God, which were the Kalam cosmological argument, or which is the argument from contingency. And we also looked at the design argument. But today we will analyze specifically the criticisms against Islam, against the religion of Islam. Even though, generally speaking, the Kalam cosmological argument, or whether it's the design argument, is not something agreed upon by philosophers. Theologians will agree on this, but philosophers will differ amongst themselves. Most atheist philosophers will tend to mention the argument from theodicy, the problem of evil, and theologians who are philosophers will quote the Kalam cosmological argument or the design argument. This, of course, is Western philosophy. When we talk about philosophy, we are discussing Western philosophy. Modern Western philosophy, however, has not developed a sound interpretation of Islamic theology. Islamic theology is called Ilm al-Kalam, the knowledge of al-Kalam. Why was it called al-Kalam? There is a lot of speculation regarding this. Some of the theologians have stated that the reason for the science being called Ilm al-Kalam was because discussion was involved. And in Arabic, the word al-Kalam means discussion. So, in the early period of Islam, when the masajid, the mosques, were used for discussion, the Muslim clerics would sit with a circle of students, and sometimes their students will disagree with them. And this happened with Al-Hasan al-Basri. So his students who disputed with him formed a separate circle, and they would teach their own philosophy because they were influenced by Greek philosophy. And this led to debates between traditional theologians, traditional Muslim theologians, and those who were influenced by Greek philosophy. In the masajid, they will debate, and in Arabic, kalam is speech, so the science became known as Ilm al-Kalam, Islamic theology. Interpretation of Islamic theology in the Western world has been weak, mainly because those who have translated Islamic works were Orientalists, and since there was an influx of immigrants from the Indian subcontinent who happened to be Muslim, many of them were from rural backgrounds and were unable to speak in a sophisticated manner regarding Islamic theology. So much of the representation of Islam in the Western world has been through the media, through the medium of news and news reports. An example of this, for instance, before I left, I picked up David Hume's Dialogues and Natural History of Religion. In the introduction, and this was edited recently, this edition is by Professor Gaskin, which was done in 1992. So as recent as 1992, for instance, when discussing the Abrahamic faiths, he states in the introduction, causing miracles on special occasions and revealing himself and his purposes to mankind both in special revelations, example, through Abraham or Jesus or Muhammad. So even the writing of the name of the Prophet of Islam is incorrect. Even the name, even though there are many Muslims in the Western world, and this is a professor of philosophy writing for renowned universities. This is his edition of David Hume's Dialogues and Natural History of Religion. So, an ignorance of traditional kalam or kalam arguments is one of the main reasons why Islamic theology is misunderstood. Of course, William Lane Craig is famous for using the kalam argument, or he terms it the kalam argument. He has taken the argument from Muslim theologians. What his sources are, I do not know. But if you look up even dictionaries of philosophy, encyclopedias of philosophy, they do not have names of well-renowned Islamic theologians. For instance, they will have Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, but the only reason they have him in their dictionaries is because he was refuted by Averroes, Ibn Rushd. Because he was refuted by Ibn Rushd, therefore they include al-Ghazali within the compendiums. But if you look up, for instance, Al-Imam Fakhruddin al-Razi, who wrote many works, you tend not to find Al-Imam Fakhruddin al-Razi in some of the famous encyclopedias of philosophy. So our task is to observe some of the absurd arguments and fallacies. Absurd arguments against Islam specifically. Now, sometimes arguments, for instance, Bertrand Russell is famously known to have said he could easily argue for the existence of a teapot God, meaning a teapot floating in the skies and with cups and saucers around it. He could easily argue for a teapot God in the way theologians will argue for the existence of God. This, in reality, we will say as Muslims that this is disanalogy, meaning you have an analogy, but sometimes the analogy does not fit in. Because when we talk regarding God or the ultimate existence, we discuss the ultimate existence as being eternal, and we discuss the aseity of God, meaning self-subsistence. God is self-existent. He does not need anything else. But in Western Christian theology, they believe in the divinity of Christ. Unlike Muslims, Muslims do not believe in the divinity of a man or a man God or a creature God or any God who has any likeness to creation in any way or form, which the traditional theologians have called al-mukhalafatu lil-hawadith, opposition to contingent things. So there is no similarity between the two. This is why we would say regarding Russell's argument that this is disanalogy. The analogy does not fit with Islam. Now, why would this be a fallacy when discussing Islam? Because many times a distinction is not made between Islam and Christianity. When discussing Christian theology or any other theology, whether that is theology from the Hindu religion or any other religion, a distinction is not drawn. And this distinction not being made is what leads to people making false analogies. Islamic theology or ilm al-kalam is based upon rational thought. This is our claim. Can we live up to this claim? Well, firstly, anyone who studies a basic text in traditional Ash'ari kalam. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar, Ash'ari kalam is Orthodox Islam, mainstream Islam. If you study a traditional text, in the beginning of the text they will mention that the one who blindly follows in his faith is unacceptable, his belief is unacceptable. We will not use the word faith, because if you check a traditional definition of faith, some dictionaries may say faith is blind. So we will say belief. Someone who believes in something but does not believe based upon evidence. And the rational faculty, the traditional theologians, firstly, the majority of them, have said his faith may be acceptable religiously speaking, but he will never cease to be in doubt. He will always remain in doubt. And some of them have said his faith or his belief is unacceptable. Why? Because he has gone against the very order of the Quran, which says, فَعْلَمْ أَنَّهُ لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا اللَّهِ. The Quran states, know that there is no deity, only Allah, which Allah would translate as the unique creator or the unique God. So, because of this, the person, some of them have said he is sinful because he believes without verifying. Now this, of course, does not mean that the person must become a theologian or be trained in philosophy or philosophical arguments or science or natural sciences or anything else. No. This differs from person to person. Sometimes they mention the story of the Bedouin. The Bedouin, when asked why does he believe in a creator, he said, when I see the dung trail, I know that this trail of dung leads to a camel. When I see the mountains and the desert, I know that there is a creator. A simple argument. Of course, someone trained in a university in philosophy will not accept this argument, but theologians will say his faith is acceptable according to his level of understanding. So the more sophisticated a person is in his learning, and the more intellect he has been endowed, then he is more responsible. His responsibility will grow. The level of responsibility will be higher. So you will have to know the arguments or the proofs for the existence of the divine creator. This is something foundational in Islam. What do they use as arguments? Previously we covered this, but I will give some examples. For instance, impossibility of those things which are known intuitively. Intuitively we know so many things. For instance, we know of the impossibility of circular reasoning. Circular reasoning is something impossible. For instance, if I say A caused B and B caused A, and then A caused B, this circular reasoning would be impossible. So when discussing, they will base an argument on deductive logic, and then they will say they will cancel out all things which are impossible. One of those impossibilities would be circular reasoning. Or for instance, continuous regression. They will mention that something cannot regress continuously. Continuous regression would be an impossibility. At some point, something would have to stop at an initial cause. For instance, if I said, I received a plant from my neighbor, and you say, where did your neighbor receive that plant? I will say he bought this plant at a shop. Where did the shop receive this plant? They got this plant from a garden. The plant would have to stop somewhere. Otherwise this would lead to continuous regression. We cannot say he received the plant from his neighbor and his neighbor received the plant from his neighbor and he received the plant from his neighbor, continuously ad infinitum, no end. No. The theologian said this is a rational impossibility. Another example of what they refer to as a rational impossibility is something from nothing. That something cannot come from nothing. These are examples of rational impossibilities which Muslim theologians would negate throughout their texts. These are just a few examples. So, Islamic belief, the very foundations of Islamic belief, which is based upon the testimony of faith, La ilaha illallah, and the second portion, Muhammadur Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, were based upon the rational mind. For instance, La ilaha illallah, the Muslim theologians developed the Kalam argument, and they developed the argument from design. These, of course, were taken from the Quran. The Quran itself exhorted, encouraged people to look around themselves to deduce the existence of the divine creator. Now, some of the fallacies which are mentioned, apart from the few that I've mentioned, for instance, belief is blind, in Islam that will not hold any water. If someone says he is doubtful of his faith, in Islam he is not considered a believer. A believer would have to be 100% sure with his mind, as well as his heart. Another fallacy being analogy of one religion with another, and also the fallacy of looking at religious people and drawing a conclusion regarding the religion. This, of course, remember, religious people may do this with atheists also. If they observe atheists and they see faults with certain atheists, they may draw a conclusion regarding atheism. This is a fallacy. In the same way, if someone observes the faults of religious people, or religious people misinterpreting religious texts through fanaticism or fundamentalism in the negative connotation used in the media, then drawing an analogy from that to the religion itself is false analogy. Another example, a famous example, is the question, is Islam opposed to science? This is something which people have the right to ask. Is Islam opposed to science? The simple answer would be no. That Muslims are not opposed to science. They are not opposed to scientific research. They are not opposed to medicine. Rather than saying Muslims, I would say Islam is not opposed to scientific research. Islam is not opposed to medicine. Islam is not opposed to any type of scientific theory which is based on fact. Any scientific theory which is based on fact. Now, what method did the Islamic theologians employ in verifying scientific fact? Did they have a method? Before going on to that, I would also like to mention, is belief in the divine creator a scientific theory, as Richard Dawkins states? Richard Dawkins believes that belief in God is a scientific theory. We will say in answer to that objection that belief in God is not a scientific theory. It is something based upon deduction and also spiritual experience, but when discussing with atheists, we will not use spiritual experience as an evidence. Because for the atheist, spiritual experience may be speculation or a fault of the mind or something wrong with the person. Sometimes some people sit in spiritual seclusion, have a lack of food and water, and may feel that they are having a spiritual experience. The argument will be deduction. Now, our arguments against atheism, are our arguments there in order to convince atheists? We will say no. The most a theologian can do is to silence the opponent. Whether the person accepts Islam after this is his own choice. We cannot force the religion upon a person. But rationally speaking, the idea behind Islamic theology is to silence the opponent. So, what method did the Muslim theologians employ in deducing scientific facts or in making inferences regarding science? Number one is sensory perception. They did not go against anything which is sensed with the five senses. For instance, in the Muslim world, we did not have an uproar, unlike the Catholic Church, regarding the heliocentric model of the universe. There were Muslim scholars who held the position of the geocentric version of the universe. But when Copernicus and Galileo forwarded the theory of the heliocentric model of the universe, this did not lead to an upheaval in the Muslim world. Why? Because prior to them, there were Muslims who held that position. These things were looked upon as a matter of interpretation of those things which are perceived with the faculties. Whatever we perceive with our faculties, and whatever induction we may make from those faculties, may differ from person to person. But certain things will be called factual. For instance, the color of something. Unless the person is colorblind. Unless the person is colorblind, if you can witness the color of something, you will not debate the color of something with that person. Remember, colorblindness was discovered later in the Middle Ages. Prior to the Middle Ages, people being colorblind was not recognized. But anyhow, the sensory perception, if something is based upon sensory perception, we claim as Muslims that the Quran, because the Quran is the first source of Islam, the Quran will not go against anything which is perceived by the five senses. At this point, some people may have objections by pointing out some verses of the Quran, but we will go on to that later. Sensory perception. Secondly, if the scientific fact is based upon deduction, deduction is a form of logic which takes a universal principle and applies it upon individual things. We believe this imparts certainty. If someone takes a universal rule and applies that universal rule upon individual things, then this will imply certainty. So if there is a universal rule, Muslim theologians will not reject that universal rule. And thirdly, truthful reports of historical accounts, or historical accounts of events. If an event took place and there are truthful reports regarding that, Muslims will not reject that report. Of course, the Muslims developed a method of verifying reports. Many of you will be familiar of the science of hadith. Hadith is in reference to literature which was compiled by the early Muslims, which contained reports of the Prophet of Islam, alayhi salam. So there is a verification method in Islam of verifying reports. So if there is a historical report which has been mass transmitted, for instance, John F. Kennedy was assassinated. This has been transmitted to us through multiple people. Now, if the report, however, is based upon an illogical, irrational point, for instance, Muslims will say regarding Buddha being God, they will say, even though millions of people may say this, Muslims will reject this, because they will say it is irrational for a human being to be God. It is irrational for a creature to be God. So this is the third method of verifying reports. So a question arises here, which is very pertinent to this discussion. Why are Muslims behind in science today? Why are Muslims behind in science? We can answer this, we can tackle this question in many ways. Some people have attempted to tackle this through historical facts and looking at Muslims geopolitically and the causes of the lack of advancement in science in the Muslim world. But I will want to answer this theologically. Why are Muslims not making progress in science? The answer would be that the way Allah has created human beings is such that if human beings place effort in any endeavor, whether that is scientific progression, economic progression, military progression, they will advance in that specific field. For instance, the Chinese. The Chinese are renowned to have made paper thousands of years ago. The Chinese are a hard-working nation. Any advancements they have made based upon their own efforts. The same will be truthful of the Russians, the Indians, and any other nation like America or Europe. The situation of the Arabs was such that prior to Islam, the Arabs did not have any type of progress. This is a historical fact. They were people limited to the deserts, deserts of Arabia. They had no progression in any way or form. Yes, they were advanced in language. The Arabic language is a very sophisticated language. But most Arabs could not read and write prior to the Quran. Once the revelation of the Quran took place, the Arabs progressed and they conquered different regions of the world and established a civilization which extended from Spain to modern day Sindh, which is in Pakistan, Western Pakistan, and even into regions like Kabul in Afghanistan. After this, whenever the Arabs move away from their religion, they go back to their original state. And that is the way they were when they were in the deserts. If they move away from their religion, they will not have that victory which they had in the first 100 years of Islam. In fact, they will revert back to their original state. And this is the way humanity is. If human beings place effort in any endeavor, whether that is science, they will progress. It is not relative to people being Muslim or non-Muslim. So if Muslims today, who are not Arabs, non-Arab Muslims, why are they not advancing? I will say they are not advancing because they are not funding scientific research. Their governments are not funding scientific research. If someone states that is due to Islam that they are not funding scientific research, I would say that is a fallacy. Because most of us who originate from the Muslim world know that the Muslim governments are secular. Muslim governments, with the exception of Saudi Arabia and Iran, most of the Muslim governments are secular. Saudi Arabia and Iran have claims to being theocracies, regions governed by religion. So, any lack of progress in the Muslim world is due to their own lack of efforts, but not because the Quran or the Hadith literature is in opposition to scientific research. Now, going on to 15 atheist fallacies when discussing Islam. Before coming here, I jotted down 15 fallacies. We'll go through each one, and in the questions and answers you can ask me regarding these things, and then after that I will mention 2 more points, and then we will open up for questions and answers. 15 atheist fallacies when discussing Islam. And these are, if there are any atheists, you can jot these down, so in the questions and answers, either you can tackle the fallacy, that in reality it is not a fallacy, or you can make sure you do not fall into this fallacy when discussing. Number 1, generalizing something which is specific. For instance, if you read the Quran or you read the Hadith and you find something which is specific to an event or specific to a ruling in a given situation, the person may make a mistake of generalizing this. This is one mistake, one fallacy. Number 2, and this happens with verses of the Quran, especially if people are on the level of Newsnight discussions with Jeremy Paxman and they have only 3 minutes to say something, they will quote the Quran and maybe mention a verse which will be viewed by millions of viewers and then, or heard by millions of viewers, and then the context will not be mentioned. So this is a fallacy. Or for instance, specifying something general. So there may be something general, something good, a rule which is general. And the atheist may commit the fallacy of specifying by saying this is specific. For instance, the hadith states, do not kill women and children in war. Now the hadith states, which is mass transmitted, do not kill women and children in war. But by observing the actions of ISIS or any other terrorist organization, an atheist may say, this incident was specific, and we will say, how do you know it was specific? We base that upon the actions of ISIS. Is this not a fallacy? Did we not mention previously the fallacy of judging a religion by the actions of religious people? That would be considered a fallacy. Third fallacy, additions which are not in the general. So you will have a general statement in the Quran or the Hadith. A person will quote that general statement and they will add additions to that. For instance, the verses in the Quran which state, kill the polytheists wherever you may find them. Where is the context of that verse? Of course, a Muslim who reads the Quran will know the context is the verse is relating to the treaty which was broken between the Quraysh and the Muslims. And when the Quraysh decided to attack tribes, the Muslims were ordered to attack the polytheist army. This is the context of that verse. But what will the fallacy do? The fallacy will add an additional thing. This was done by Nick Griffin, the BNP, former leader of BNP. He mentioned these type of verses when he said on television that I will slay the Islamic dragon, live on TV. I mean, he begged the BBC to give him airtime, saying, give me airtime and I will slay the Islamic dragon. But again, it was a fallacy. Fallacy number 4. Hiding conditions and limits which change the context. For instance, if there is a ruling in the Quran or the Hadith which has conditions and limits, this hiding the conditions and the limits will change the total context. For instance, if someone mentions amputations of the hand in the Quran, that the thief, his hand must be amputated. Of course, any learned Muslim will know there are conditions to this. Conditions and limitations. But quoting that verse will be sufficient for the atheist. But remember, Muslims also may fall into these fallacies. For instance, when Muslims may quote the Bible to a Christian, many times, many Muslims have misquoted the Bible to a Christian, taking certain verses of the Bible out of context. So this again is a fallacy. Number 5, using quotes without the previous or following text. Again, this will apply to the verses of jihad. Once in this masjid, I debated a Christian preacher for many weeks. He came for many weeks. One of the first contentions he had was jihad. So we placed all the entire verses of the Quran together relating to jihad, and when he saw the true context, he dropped that argument. He dropped the argument of jihad. But then I mentioned to him the verses of the Bible, and I challenged him to place, of the Old Testament and of the New Testament, to place those verses of the Bible in their true context. He was not able to live up to that challenge. The only answer he had was that the verses of killing were from the Old Testament and the verses of mercy are from the New Testament. But I said, the God who ordered in the Old Testament is the same God who has ordered in the New Testament. So the God is the same. But with the Quran, he was unable to do that when we placed the entire verses of jihad in true context. So that is an example of this fallacy. Number 6, playing with the meaning of the text to establish a point. The meaning may be clear, but sometimes a person may attempt to change the meaning in order to make a point. This is also a fallacy. Number 7 is the straw man fallacy, which is well known in logic. the straw man fallacy is making an argument, a presumption, and then attacking the presumption according to your own devices. So you make an argument and then you attack the argument in order to make your opponent look weak. So if you do this, you present a weak argument. So an atheist may claim, I am doing this also, by saying he's presenting straw man arguments, but they will have to demonstrate how what I have said is a straw man argument. But a straw man argument, simply put, is placing a false premise and then attacking that premise because the premise is weak in itself. Number 8. Using a mistaken ijtihad of a scholar. Now, the non-Muslims here, or even Muslims who do not know what ijtihad is when there is a difference of opinion amongst scholars on a given point, each scholar will exert his efforts in order to establish a ruling. He could be mistaken or he could be right. These are differences of opinion. So sometimes a scholar will make a mistake. But now remember, when I say atheists, I'm not referring to Western atheists specifically. I can be referring to Arab atheists, atheists in the Arab world, people who read Arabic and read books written by Muslim scholars. They may attempt to present the mistake of a scholar as the given position of Islam. Examples in the West, for instance, we have individuals like Umar Bakri. Now, Umar Bakri is not a recognized scholar, even though anyone who grows a beard is posed off as a cleric in the media. For instance, Anjum Chaudhry, generally speaking, they mention he's a cleric. He has no clerical training, no recognized clerical training from any sect, but yet he's posed as a cleric. Now, if he makes a statement and an atheist uses his example as a position, the given position of Islam, this will be a fallacy. In fact, Anjum Chaudhry is an unqualified individual. If you present the position of a qualified scholar, if you present the position of a qualified scholar, and the scholar is mistaken, then even then the premise is false, because scholars who have made mistakes, it is not essential upon Muslims to follow them. As we mentioned previously, that the very faith a person has or belief a person has is based upon knowledge. You must have knowledge in order to have faith. Number 9. Using the position of a sect. Within Islam, like Christianity, we have sects. Now, when we say a given position of Islam, that would be the given position of Islam from the Quran, or and even when given a position from the Quran, the verse of the Quran would have to be very clear as to what it alludes to, not unclear. From the hadith, mass transmitted hadith. What do we mean by mass transmitted? A hadith which is not rejected by any Muslim, and the consensus of all the Muslim sects, not the given position of a sect, because Islam was and is a free religion. How? What is the greatest evidence of this? The greatest evidence of this is the first 100 years of Islam. The number of sects that arose in the first 100 years of Islam, or the first 200 years of Islam, exceed the number of sects that there are in Islam today. The masjid in Basra or Kufa, these cities in Iraq, were filled with the sects debating one another. There was freedom of speech. So this freedom allowed for different views. But an atheist may use the view of a sect in order to say this is the default position of Islam. Whenever stating the position of Islam, it would be necessary for the atheist to present the consensus of the Muslims. Even today, for instance, sex change, gender change, operation for gender change is permissible according to the Shia in Iran. In Iran they allow sex change. The Sunni Muslims do not allow this. But if someone uses this argument, this will be a fallacy. If they try deducing or making an inductive argument from this point, this will be a fallacy. Okay. Point number 10. Texts attribute without verifying. Now this, an example of this. How many of you have heard that when Sayyidina Umar radiallahu anhu, the Khalifa Umar, the Caliph Umar radiallahu anhu, when he conquered Alexandria in Egypt, he had the library of Alexandria burnt. How many of you have heard this? One person. Have you heard this? You've heard this, two, three people. Do you know the source for this account? You do not know the source for this account. Do you know the source for this account? Do you know the source? Exactly. The source for that account was written 600 years after Umar radiallahu anhu, without a chain, no chain. And surprisingly, or coincidentally, within the Crusader period. Within the Crusader period, this account was written. Historically speaking, Muslims will not accept this, that Umar radiallahu anhu had a library burnt, because we do not believe in book burning. Despite what you saw in the 80s with the Salman Rushdie book burning, it is not an intrinsic belief of Muslims to burn books. Our theological position is to counter the arguments of those books. Otherwise, there are books extant available today in the Muslim world which speak against Islam. But the scholars have answered those books. For instance, the work of Ibn Rushd, Averroes, which he wrote against Imam Ghazali, is available in the Arabic market. So, text attributed without verifying. This is very important, that when attributing something, you must look at how Muslims have classified things. If the report is chainless, what do we mean by chain? In the Muslim world, we have a verification method, that such and such person reported to such and such person reported to such and such, until there is a chain from the person who is reporting to what he is reporting. And then the scholars will verify the chain. What do we mean by verifying? They will check the biographies of every individual. If the biography is unknown, the report will be rejected. This is a verification method, unlike Western archaeology. For instance, in Western archaeology, they will find the remnants of a place and they will draw inductions, make an inductive argument based upon what they perceive. Unless the thing is obvious, Muslim historians will leave everything as assumption. All of that will count for assumption, not as historical fact. Historical fact will only be based upon reports which have been verified. So the report of Umar radiallahu anhu means Allah be well pleased with him. Burning the library of Alexandria is a report which cannot be verified. And Western Orientalists took this report and used it. Whenever you check the biographies of Umar radiallahu anhu, you will find that they mention this account. In fact, Google the account, you will find Christians using this example. Hiding or ignorance of valid texts. So sometimes a person may be told Islam is a religion of violence, but they will not know or be familiar of the texts which exhorted people to be peaceful. Or they will hide those texts, and they will only highlight those texts which have perceived violence. In reality, those rulings were relating to military rulings. Number 12. Science is based upon atheism. This is a fallacy. This fallacy is committed also by Arab atheists, that scientific progression and atheism are something which are intrinsically linked. Both of them revolve around one another. This is false. In fact, most of the scientists of the past were theists, whether Muslim or non-Muslim. Of course, there is a general ignorance of Muslim scientific contribution in the Western world. But whether those scientists, the vast majority of scientists who contributed to science, within the past 1400 years have been theists, whether they were from the Western world or from the Muslim world. Number 13, red herring, or what I would call side issues fallacy. For instance, if someone asks me regarding the argument for God, and I present to him the design argument, or present to him a teleological argument, or the Kalam cosmological argument, the person may start debating from theodicy, the problem of evil. These are two things which are unrelated. This is a fallacy, a red herring. So if we are discussing a given point, the atheist may place a red herring. Of course, this fallacy can be done by theists also. If they are debating a Christian or they are debating a non-Muslim who is an atheist, the atheist may pose a question and the Muslim may dodge the question by placing a red herring. Number 14, appeal to popularity or authority. For instance, if something is popular, it does not make it factual. If something is well known, it does not make it factual. Or authority, by saying, the Pope said this. Of course, in the Muslim world and the Christian world, when I say the Christian world, the Catholic world, are poles apart in terms of authority. Within the Muslim world, anyone who studies Islam reaches a level of qualification where he is recognized by his peers, becomes a scholar. Now, whether people accept him as an authority is a personal choice. Unlike the Catholic Church, when the Pope gives an edict, Catholics must follow. But in the Muslim world, there is no such thing. So even the Mufti, the one who gives the fatwa of Saudi Arabia, it is not essential upon Muslims to follow him. There are many Muslims who oppose him. Or the Khamenei in Iran. If the Khamenei gives they call them the Ayatollahs. If the Ayatollah gives a verdict in Iran, it is not essential upon Muslims to follow him. In fact, the fatwa will be analyzed by other theologians, other jurists. They will analyze his verdict. So appeal to popularity or appeal to authority is something which is not accepted. Of course, authority of the Quran or authority of the Hadith, the sayings of the Prophet, upon whom be peace, this is not what we are discussing. Number 15, misusing words. For instance, like making a distinction between belief and reason. Some people will say belief is not built on reason. But you may have met some people who have a belief which they do not base upon reason, but the given position of the majority of Muslims is that if belief is not built upon reason, then such a belief, according to some of them, is invalid, and according to another group, such a person is sinful, because he has not based his faith upon reason. These are 15 fallacies that we must avoid in discussion. One other point is regarding verses of the Quran or Hadith. Before finishing and opening up for questions and answers, I would want to make 2 points. Number one is something in Islamic law, Sharia law, which is known as Ahkam al-Sulta, which is laws of governance. What do we mean by laws of governance? There are many verses in the Quran which relate to governance. If the context of those verses is not shown, then people can fall into fallacies. For instance, slavery in the Quran. Why is there slavery in the Quran? This is a question which people may have had at questions and answer session. The answer would be that in pre-Islamic Arabia, slavery was entrenched in Arabian culture. In fact, within the Roman culture, also Roman and Persian cultures. When the Quran was revealed, in that context, verses regarding slavery were revealed. When Islam, the religion, the rulings of Islam developed, those rulings mention, for instance, if you have a slave, the slave must eat the same food as you. The slave must wear the same quality of clothing as you. And if the slave has a complaint against his master, he has the right to go and complain to the ruler. Another example, that a person cannot call his slave my slave. Another example, the person must not burden his slave with too much work. These were rulings which developed over time. Why did the rulings take time? This is something you can ask in questions and answers. Then Islam established freeing slaves. If someone commits manslaughter, he must free a slave. If someone breaks an oath, he must free a slave. If someone commits X, Y, and Z, he must free a slave. So emancipation of slaves is mentioned in the Quran. But someone at this point may object and say, why in the Quran are the verses which mention taking captives or slaves? The answer would be, the context of those verses was relating to war. The disbelievers at that time would take Muslim men and women and children as slaves. So the Quran gave the choice to the Prophet that you have 4 choices. Number 1, you can take them as captives. Number 2, you can take a ransom. Number 3, you can kill them. And number 4, you can free them. This was a choice in that given context. I would want to ask those who are familiar, which choice did the Prophet take in the Battle of Badr? Taking a ransom for them. So that verse also has a context, and many of them were free. The context of that verse was that the non-Muslims were taking the Muslims as slaves. So this is why the action of ISIS today, of taking the Yazidi women as slaves, is also decontextualizing those verses. That the slavery was only something legislated in a context where the non-Muslims were taking Muslims as slaves. But even then, when those slaves were taken, they were given rights. The number of rights that they are given are known in the Islamic text. Another famous example of what we call rules of governance is jihad. I challenge any non-Muslim or Muslim that the verses relating to jihad, the context of all those verses was defensive. Defensive to remove a threat from the state or any potential threat. Even the incidents in the life of the Prophet, upon whom be peace, those incidents related to defense of the Muslim lands. Even the Islamic conquest, someone may say, then what is the context of the Islamic conquest? I will again say that the context of the Islamic conquest was also defensive. This is my proposition. If anyone, Muslim or non-Muslim, would want to challenge me on that proposition, they can in questions and answers. Then we have rules relating to hudud. What is hudud? Corporal punishment. Again, I will mention that corporal punishments which are mentioned in the Quran. What are corporal punishments? Lashing or stoning to death. Can I ask you a question? How many of you think stoning to death is in the Quran? It is. Yeah? Stoning to death is in the Quran. Anyone else who thinks that stoning to death is in the Quran? Okay, in questions and answer session, please show me the verse of stoning to death in the Quran. That is something for us to ponder upon. But hudud punishment, what is mentioned in the Quran is lashing. Again, when the corporal punishments of Islam are mentioned in questions and answers, I would want to hear the true context of those rulings. What is the ruling? What is the detail to that ruling? And what application? So what fallacy? If someone mentions the ruling without mentioning the conditions, which number fallacy do they fall into? Fallacy number 4. Those of you taking notes, if you've written it, hiding conditions and limits which change the context. So every question which will commit a fallacy, we will refer back to this fallacy. Lastly, I would want to mention the distinction between mutawatir and non-mutawatir. What do we mean by mutawatir? Mutawatir is mass transmission. Mass transmission is a concept in Islam that so many people give a report regarding something that it was impossible for those people to congregate and form a lie. That number of people passes on that report to a similar or a larger number of people, a number that exceeds the initial number. And this continues through an unbroken chain. This is known as something as mutawatir. The Christians will claim this regarding the crucifixion. For instance, they will say Christ was crucified. This was witnessed by a large number of people, and this report continued to our day today. This is known as mutawatir, mass transmission. Mass transmission is different to non-mass transmission. So when we record a hadith, a report of the Prophet, upon whom be peace, that hadith would have to fit the criteria of mass transmission for all Muslims to accept. Those hadiths which do not fall into mass transmission are those things which are debatable. Those things which Muslims will debate amongst themselves. Is this report sufficient? For instance, many non-Muslims now are familiar with Bukhari and Muslim. But I would like to ask another question from the audience. Are all the hadiths in Bukhari and Muslim mutawatir, mass transmitted? Are they all mutawatir? The answer will be no. There are some reports which are mutawatir. What do we mean by mutawatir? Again, mutawatir will be not only Bukhari records the hadith, Muslim records the hadith, all the other sources of Islam also record that hadith from different narrators. This is something known as mutawatir, mass transmission. So, when discussing, we will discuss verses of the Quran, which, by the way, the entire Quran is considered mutawatir, mass transmitted. The Quran is not classified into mutawatir and non-mutawatir. The Quran is all mutawatir. But the hadith is classified into mutawatir and non-mutawatir. So for a non-Muslim, it's a tip for non-Muslims or former Muslims or Christians, when debating someone like myself, I will give you a tip. When discussing a hadith, make the distinction, is this mutawatir or non-mutawatir? How do you check? You can verify. Verify from scholars have compiled dictionaries on mutawatir hadiths, all those hadiths which are agreed upon by everyone. So those dictionaries are available in Arabic, or you can consult someone who is an Orientalist from, what's the college in London? Orientalist college in London? SOAS, yes. School of African and Orientalist Studies. Or School of Orientalist and African Studies. So anyone who studies in SOAS, you can ask them what is the distinction. Or Birmingham University, if they study Islamic studies. So here I finished my presentation, and now we will open up for questions and answers. If there are written questions, you can pass them to the front. And if anyone would want to speak on the microphone, they can come to the microphone, or if they want, they can stand where they are, and they can ask their questions. First, we'll take written questions. Remember, if the questions go on till late night, I'm here ready to answer till late night also. And if anyone will want to discuss after the event as well, they can discuss after the event also. Are there any questions? Does that answer your question? If you have anything to add, can you please stand up?
Can theology and philosophy cross roads as well at the same time?
Yes, in the West they term that as being philosophical theology. There's words like the philosophy of the Kalam, for instance, which is basically rationalizing theological beliefs. And theology is a branch of philosophy according to Western philosophers. Theology is a branch of philosophy. This is why our Salafi brothers mistaken Ash'ari Kalam as philosophy. They make the mistake of associating Ash'ari theology with philosophy, because the Ash'aris are the ones who countered philosophical thought in the Muslim world. Does that answer your question? Should we go on to the written questions, or are there any more? We'll go back onto anyone else? Stand up, brother, please.
You said in your lecture that Islam and science do not contradict each other. So would you say that Muslims should practice science and further themselves in Western science?
Remember, when it comes, the question is, should we encourage Muslims to go into the sciences? I would say, and Western science was mentioned specifically. Remember, science and advancement in science is the property of humanity. It is not the property of a religious group or a race. So in reality, there is no challenge between Western science and Islam. But at the same time, I will say Islam and Muslims must study the sciences like physics, biology, chemistry, and make advances to benefit humanity. Remember, historically speaking, Muslims knew the use of oil, of crude oil. They knew the use of crude oil. But the Ottoman Empire prohibited the use of crude oil. Why did they prohibit the use of crude oil? Because they said crude oil is bad for the environment. If we start burning crude oil, this will cause the air to be polluted. So there are ethical guidelines in Islam for science. Ethical guidelines. But Islam does not stop the advancement of science or Muslims going into the sciences. Is that clear? You placed your hand up again. You have a...
I want to add, like Western science is practiced in a very destructive manner. Like some of the way it's practiced damages the environment.
What I just mentioned regarding ethical... yeah.
If a Muslim wants to become a scientist, he can, but restrictions.
A Muslim scientist would be guided by ethical guidelines as set out in Islam. Guideline number 1 would be the preservation of life. Guideline number 2 would be preservation of wealth. Preservation of the environment. These are guidelines set out by Islam. Anything that does not contradict those basic guidelines is valid. So nuclear weapons, for instance, the Muslims were not the ones who invented nuclear weapons. Muslims were not the ones who invented weapons of mass destruction. How the world would have turned out if the Ottomans were victorious over Europe, we do not know. Is there...
Just want to clarify one thing. You spoke and you talked that without 100% belief, a person becomes a non-believer. Is that what you said?
Yes.
Okay.
Basically, if someone has a doubt, a reasonable doubt, making a distinction between reasonable doubt and something which Muslims call waswasa. Do you know what waswasa is? Which is just a thought. Drawing a distinction between the two. An actual doubt makes a person, in philosophy, what do they term such a person? Agnostic. Agnosticism is not Islam. A person who is an agnostic is not a Muslim. And this is one of the main reasons why Muslims have a weak outlook amongst other people. For instance, people will ask, there are so many Muslims, but they do not practice such and such aspect of Islam. The reason being that there are many agnostics amongst them. But legally speaking, we have not been told to term those people as non-Muslims. Why? Because the ultimate judge is who? Allah. Allah will judge them. We are told as Muslims to judge an outward behavior. If someone says openly he's a Muslim, we are told to call him a Muslim. But the reality on the Day of Judgment, we may find someone who openly was a non-Muslim, but inwardly believed in Islam and died as a Muslim. Legally speaking on earth, we are told to treat him as a non-Muslim. What do we mean by treat him as a non-Muslim? Meaning, we do not pray the funeral prayer over him. We do not send mercy upon his soul. But there may be some people who outwardly died as Muslims, but on the Day of Judgment it will be revealed that such a person was in reality an agnostic. So a person would have to believe in the Quran and the Prophet, peace be upon him, completely. But that belief must be based upon his mind and heart according to his ability.
Okay, so in the age of science, how do you prove empirically that there is?
Again,
100%
this,
so you've got the science part and you've got the theological part.
the question,
that in today's day and age is science at the moment, isn't it? So we need the evidence from science as well as theology.
okay. The question is, in the age of science, how do we establish the existence of God? As you've been listening from the onset, I've said there's no contradiction between science and Islam, or science and theology. Because there is no contradiction between the two, theology is not compelled, Islam is not compelled to prove the existence of God via science. Secondly, science itself is inadequate of reaching a conclusion regarding the existence of God. Because science has its own inadequacies, therefore not every answer is given by science. Yes, science has its role, but the role of science is limited. It can benefit human beings through inventions like this microphone, other things, but never have we claimed that science can answer metaphysical or ultimate questions. Therefore, if anyone states that there is a clash between Islam and science, as I mentioned in my lecture, this would fall under a fallacy. Is that clear?
Yeah.
Okay. Go on with that. Hat trick now.
Can I sit down?
Yeah, I think everyone knows who you are now.
Extremely pertinent to this brother's question. Do you know much about epistemology? The science.
I can't qualify how much I know about the subject, but just get to the question, please.
So we were saying the deficiencies of science or limitations of
Yeah,
science. In terms
epistemology, how we achieve knowledge and methods of learning.
in terms of science, that is. So you're saying the limitations of science. I suppose, personally, the question is, if we know the limitations of science, then there wouldn't be questions on can we prove God by science. I think we need to know the distinction of what science can lead us to.
You see, if an atheist had asked me that question in a debate about science, I would ask that atheist to define for me the limits of science and in fact define science itself and the scientific method. Is there agreement among scientists on the scientific method? There is no agreement. So something which is not defined in its method cannot lead us to ultimate questions. Secondly, in science you have regular paradigm shifts. What do we mean by paradigm shifts? How we interpret data differs from scientist to scientist. For instance, going back to the pendulum example, when Aristotle would observe the pendulum moving, he concluded that the pendulum has an innate nature to move. But Newton observed the same thing and came to the conclusion that there is a force known as gravity. Both of them observed the same data. Data interpretation would be classified as being a paradigm. In science, there are regular paradigm shifts, where some scientists will have a paradigm, but there may be an anomaly in that paradigm, and then that will lead to puzzle solving. That puzzle solving is termed as science. Eventually, puzzle solving will lead to a revolution in that paradigm, which will give birth to another paradigm. Initially, it may be in an embryonic stage, but later that paradigm will grow until it becomes mainstream. What do we mean by mainstream? That certain scientists will accept that paradigm shift. So science is not something which is immutable. Science is something which shifts from interpretation to interpretation. Is the time now? Okay, we will continue after the prayer. If there are any non-Muslims, they can just sit at the back. After the prayer, questions and answers session will continue. The first written question that we have here: why do people say Islam was spread by the sword? This claim is an old claim from the colonial period, when Orientalists made this claim, up until today. The claim is refuted by historical fact. For instance, in Syria, you have over 15% of the population which is Christian, and prior to the formation of Israel, there was a population of Jews living and residing within Syria. If Islam was spread by the sword, in modern Syria, there would not be a Christian community, because Damascus was one of the first cities conquered by the Muslims. In the same way, in Iraq, there are many Christian minorities and other religions. In Egypt, the Copts alone make a population that exceeds 10 million. If Islam was spread in these lands by the sword, no minority would have remained. Islam entered Indonesia and Malaysia. Millions of people accepted Islam in Indonesia and Malaysia, and to this day, no Arab army entered those lands. No army of Arabs. In fact, it was traders, Yemeni traders, who entered Indonesia and Malaysia, and people accepted Islam at their hands. In the same way, in the Indian subcontinent, even though Mughals conquered the Indian subcontinent, who were Central Asian Muslims, millions of Indians accepted Islam at the hands of preachers. People came and preached Islam in those lands. So the reason why people say Islam spread by the sword is because Islam has been a political force to be reckoned with. The Ottomans entered Vienna, but the Ottomans did not force convert anyone. They were a military power, but forced conversions were never done. So isolated incidents are quoted from the biography of the Prophet, peace be upon him, in order to superimpose the image that Islam was spread by the sword. So isolated incidents are quoted, and then an image is formed that this shows that Islam was spread by the sword. But like I said, when we categorize the Quran and the Hadith, we must make a distinction between mutawatir, mass transmitted, and non-mass transmitted. And then, if the report is not mass transmitted, we must verify the context of that report. Also, the reporter, the one who made the report, did he make a mistake? Did he forget something? Was there a context to this report? So there is a method of verifying those reports. If the person who wrote this question feels that the answer was not satisfactorily answered, they can write a further question. Many atheists ask, why did God allow evil and suffering? What is the Islamic theological explanation of this? When we point out suffering in the world, it is unfair to point out only the suffering in this world. It is necessary, essential, to point out that if there is a God, there is a day of judgment. And if there is a day of judgment, there is reward and punishment. So those who suffered on earth will be rewarded. Those who suffered on earth will be rewarded. But if someone takes the isolated example of this worldly life and makes a proposition based upon that, that proposition is false, because they would have to look at the entire context of the theological belief. The theological belief would be that there is a hereafter. Also, human suffering is associated with free will. Human beings have free will. Because human beings have free will, some of those human beings choose to do evil to other human beings. So there is evil which emanates from human beings from their own free will. Then there is natural disasters. The atheist who poses this question would term natural disasters as being evil. But this is something relative. When we discuss the problem of evil, natural disasters, when we term natural disasters as being evil, those natural disasters are termed as being evil relatively. How? The divine knowledge of God. When we look at the divine knowledge would encompass the outcome of any evil. The outcome of any evil would have to be determined by the divine knowledge. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will know whether the outcome of this thing is good or bad. So the concept of evil, when we look at divine actions, is something relative to the divine knowledge of God Almighty. Again, if the person feels unsatisfied with this answer, they can write another question. In the meantime, do we have any questions from the audience? Because so I can take time to drink and cough. Any questions? Please stand up and ask so people can, so people can view as well.
Okay, with the question that was, well, with your answer that you posed now, that it's relative in relation to God's divine knowledge. What if God chose it to be bad, for example? Let's, I'm playing the... let's say,
like what?
You said everything is relative in terms of God's all-encompassing knowledge. I suppose the question that would lead on, or they would say, or I'm playing the advocate, they would say, what if God chose it? What if in the divine knowledge it was action that was bad? It wasn't necessarily good. How would you answer that?
I'll give an example to.
Let's say, for example, like if I asked you, this person has doesn't have the necessities of life to live, and you might say that's in God's will. That's better for him. It might save him from some trial or whatever it might be. Could you give an example where God might do something? Is there an example where God might do something necessarily bad for someone? You said it's relative, so could you give the other example? Could you give is there good and bad, and could you explain both?
The question is there any way God Almighty can will something bad for someone? Meaning the ultimate result for that person is evil. The answer would be no. Why? Because Muslims state that injustice is an impossibility to be something ascribed to Allah. You cannot ascribe injustice to Allah. You can ascribe mercy and justice, but not injustice. Injustice will be considered something impossible. And in fact, the outcome for someone being evil would only be as a result of their own doing. For instance, children. In Islamic theology, do we believe children will go to hell? This is a question for the audience. No. But in Catholic theology, do they believe children who are not Catholic will go to hell?
Yeah.
Yes. Why do Muslims believe children will not go to hell? Because children, firstly, their intellect has not completely developed. They need to attain maturity to attain a full level of recognition, of cognition of what they are doing. Even then, the physically handicapped person or mentally disabled person, as Muslims, do we believe mentally disabled people will go to hell? No. Why? Because mentally disabled people are not taken to task. As Muslims, do we believe that someone who lived in a jungle and never heard of the Quran or the Prophet of Islam will go to hell? No. Why? Because the Quran states, وَمَا كُنَّا مُعَذِّبِينَ حَتَّى نَبْعَثَ رَسُولًا. We will not punish anyone until we send a messenger. And even then, if someone is mentally ill, mentally retarded, or a child, they will not be tasked by the Sharia or by the divine to accept Islam. So the human being who is an adult, sane, his faculties are working, meaning if there is a person who is deaf, unable to hear the message of Islam, will such a person go to hell if he is unable to comprehend the message of Islam? He is unable to comprehend the message of Islam because he is deaf. Will such a person go to hell? The answer is no. The only people who are tasked are those whose faculties are working and they are able to comprehend the message of Islam. This in Islam is called mukallaf. Such a person, if he chooses to do something bad, his outcome will be bad. But anyone who is out of this category of mukallaf, which means tasked by the divine to believe, then such a person's outcome will never be bad. His outcome will be good. Because he is not, so a child who dies on earth, we know his outcome is good because he's gone to the hereafter and the hereafter is good for him. Does that answer your question?
Could you give the reverse?
How the reverse?
So your example was, let's say there's someone with some kind of disability or deficiency in life. That deficiency in life, in the Almighty, in the all-encompassing knowledge, actually saved him, gave him salvation, for example. Could you give the reverse where he has something good, but it's actually bad for him, and why?
For instance, wealth. Is wealth and health good for everyone? We would say yes, but this is something relative. Again, for instance, if God knows this person, if he attains wealth, he will cause havoc on earth with his wealth. He will buy weapons, he will buy drugs, he will buy alcohol and cause evil on earth. Such a person, wealth may be taken away from them. and in some cases given to them to test them. This again goes back to the divine knowledge. So, in effect, sometimes what philosophers do is that they make the mistake of attempting to qualify the knowledge of God, or to judge the divine knowledge of God. As theologians, we say that we know God knows what we do not know. We accept that. And there are certain questions as human beings we will never be able to answer. But not being able to answer certain things, certain specifics, does not make the overall principle wrong. Is that clear? Is there anything you have to annotate on that? Okay. What causes an individual to become an atheist? Of course, there are social reasons. In the case of some Muslims who become atheists, there may be many factors. But if there is an objective atheist, a person who is objective and he has become atheist solely on the basis of knowledge, those are the people we are dialoguing with. If there is someone who has become an atheist because his upbringing was different to other Muslims, or because he has emotional issues with the Muslim community, or because of political reasons, our dialoguing with them is of no benefit. This seminar was composed for people who are objective atheists, people who have become atheists solely due to their mind, without any emotional baggage. For instance, I hear of some Muslims and Christians who become atheists because they were bullied at school, and this led them to looking into atheism. Of course, this is not an attack on objective atheists. If someone has become an atheist solely on objective and logical grounds, then we are open to dialogue with them. So there are many reasons, multifaceted reasons as to why people turn to atheism. Shias claim we will not get to see God on the Day of Judgment because of the verse, لَن تَرَانِي, you shall never see me. How do we answer this? Yes, the verse is in reference in Surah Al-A'raf, in reference to Sayyidina Musa alayhi salam, Moses, when he requested to see Allah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, there's a context to the verse, he said, I shall manifest myself on the mountain, and if you see, if the mountain is able to take my manifestation, you will see me. And if it is unable to see my manifestation, you shall not see me. So there is a context to the verse. In Surah Al-Qiyamah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala states, وُجُوهٌ يَوْمَئِذٍ نَاظِرَةٌ إِلَىٰ رَبِّهَا نَاظِرَةٌ. That on that day there shall be bright, illuminated faces looking at their Lord. So the Sunni Muslims have other evidence, and they place this particular verse in its true context. If God does exist, why so many people, innocent people, getting killed in the world? These are the questions written. Again, those people who are being killed at the hands of human beings. If you mean natural disasters, again, this goes back to the initial question of what is the outcome of those people. Is the outcome good for those people or bad? The outcome would be good. But if you refer to human beings killing other human beings, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala intervened in the killing of human beings on earth, then this would do away with our free will. The fact that we have free will is for earth. On the Day of Judgment, those human beings who carry out these atrocities will be judged, and they will pay for their atrocities. This is an objection to atheism, that how do you answer the fact that someone as evil as Hitler, when he died, and someone like Princess Diana or Mother Teresa, according to your atheist logic, would these two groups of people be similar? As theists, we will say no. God will judge each one according to his action. But if a person does not believe in a day of judgment, in effect they say that good and bad are equal. Good and bad are equal, and this would result in this question being defunct also. Because there is no good and bad, there is no evil. Because there is no day of judgment and no accounting for the actions of those people. Can you ever see Allah in a dream or reality? Where is Allah? Two questions. One is, can you see Allah? Like I said, the eyes that we have in this world are unable to see the manifestation of Allah on earth. But the theologians, Muslim theologians have mentioned that in the hereafter we will have the vision of Allah. Where is Allah? This question is flawed. Why? Flawed in the sense that if a person believes Allah is in a place, if however they mean to draw a distinction between idols and the ultimate God, then that is different. But by saying where is Allah, if they mean God is contained by space and time, then as Muslims we will say God existed before space and time, and He exists now as He was before the existence of space and time. He is now as He was. He is not prone to change. There is no change in God. Because if He was prone to change, this would make His nature contingent. His very nature would be contingent. And by having a contingent nature, that would mean He has a cause. Because everything contingent in the universe has a cause. And this would lead to regression. That the cause will have to have a cause, that cause will have to have a cause, that cause will have to have a cause, and to no end. So we will say, where is God? God exists without time and place, because He created time and place. Of course, this brings out the question which Christians have a problem with, is therefore you do not have a personal God. They believe God needs to manifest Himself for human beings to be able to see God and feel God. The answer to that would be, in Islam we have the concept or the belief of the divine attributes of Allah. And with those divine attributes, we see the effect within the creation. For instance, we see the mercy of God in creation. We see the divine power of God in creation. We also see the manifestation of other names and attributes of Allah. For instance, one of the names of Allah is Al-Muntaqim, the Avenger. Another name is Al-Khafid, the one who lowers. Another name is Al-Rafiq, the one who raises. So there are names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala of which we observe the manifestation around us. Christians believe in the crucifixion. How would a Muslim defend the point that the crucifixion did not occur? The crucifixion of Christ, Muslims will say that this is not an accurate historical event. Remember earlier I mentioned the concept of mutawatir, mass transmission. For an event to be true, you need mass transmission from the very inception of the event, with a continuous chain, an unbroken chain. So we will say, for instance, that the number of people who witnessed the Prophet of Islam, alayhi salatu wasalam, in Mecca was a multitude of people with an unbroken chain, a continuous chain. From that time till today, there are people who testified that He existed and the Quran was revealed upon Him. The same with Jesus Christ, peace be upon Him. That the number of people who witnessed His existence in His lifetime were a multitude of people who witnessed His existence with an unbroken chain till our time today. But the crucifixion that took place is only testified by the authors of the Gospels. and the Gospels do not reach the level of mass transmission. What is the condition of mass transmission? That it be impossible for a multitude of people to congregate and form a line. For instance, if one lived in Basra, the other lived in Kufa, the other lived in Egypt, in Cairo, the other lived in Damascus, the other lived in Mecca, the other lived in Medina, and not one person, dozens of people, it would be impossible for all of them to congregate and form a line. Before the modern age, now we are the day of technology, but in that time it would have been impossible for all of them to congregate and make a line. There is no such thing with the crucifixion. The only testament we have is the Gospels of the Bible. And the verification of the Gospels of the Bible, the Gospels were written 100 years after the raising of Jesus, Isa alayhi salam. So, is there an unbroken chain between the writers of the Gospel and Jesus himself? Peace be upon him. If there is any Christian, they can answer that question, or they can write a note. Okay, 3 questions here. If God exists, why is there evil in the world? This question has been answered. How do we know the Quran is the truth? You know the Quran is the truth if you pick up the Quran and read it from cover to cover. If someone actually reads the Quran cover to cover and understands the context of the verses, and if there is something difficult to understand, they can question a scholar of Islam. After they read the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has left the choice with them. Either they accept or reject. It is up to them. There is la ikraha fi din. There is no compulsion in religion. Someone asked about jihad. They said, we thought jihad was offensive. I said, yes, it is offensive when it is done to protect the state. But Islam did not legislate jihad except to preserve the freedom of preaching Islam. If there is a country which is not an adversary to Muslims and allows the free preaching of Islam, will the Muslim state launch jihad against such a country? The answer is no. So there is a context to that jihad. What proof is there for the prophets? Remember, prophethood in Islam is different to prophethood in Christianity. In Christianity, Christians believe prophets can lie and sin. In fact, in the Old Testament, Noah alayhi salam is described as being drunk. Lot, the prophet Lut alayhi salam, is described as having committed incest. And there are multiple sins attributed to the prophets in the Old Testament. In Muslim theology, prophets are sinless and are unable to commit sins. What is the logical evidence for this? The logical proof? The logical proof for this would be that if they were able to lie, then there would be a possibility of a lie in the divine revelation. This is the logical evidence. If they were able to commit sins, then people would not imitate them, because they are human beings that commit sin and error. While in Islamic theology, prophets are perfect human beings. This is one thing. So the perfection of the prophets is one of the proofs. Now, if Christians had this belief today, they will not have claimants to prophethood in America. Of course, in the Muslim world, there are also claimants of prophethood. Like you have in India, a man known as Mirza Ghulam Qadiani, who lived over 100 years ago. He claimed to be a prophet. How was his claim refuted? By being perfect. He was imperfect, so this showed that he is not a prophet. So perfection, human perfection, is one of the conditions, to the extent that Ash'ari theologians state that for a prophet to be a prophet, he must also have bodily perfection. He cannot even have faults. on the face and on the body. He cannot have illnesses which show some kind of defect or fault in him. So this is how we know prophets are prophets. And there is also the evidence of miracles, which is a question for anyone else to ask regarding miracles. Are there any other questions?
Yeah, so we all live in this country, and in education they teach children about evolution, and our children grow with evolution, and then that hits them. And then how can we actually counter that Western education where they're talking about evolution and godlessness, when we, on the other hand, as parents, are talking about God? How can we counter that argument?
The question is, how is the theory of evolution compatible with an Islamic education? The answer would be, remember earlier I mentioned paradigm shift. Evolution is an actual paradigm how to view scientific data. What is scientific data? The acquirement of fossils and study of the genes. Some scientists, or now the majority of scientists, have induced from this the hypothesis that this is a result of human evolution. So how do we counter this approach? We as Muslims will say that this paradigm, this induction, this hypothesis of the fossil record is something that will be prone to change. How will it be prone to change? If there is any anomaly in this hypothesis, eventually that anomaly will lead to a scientific revolution which will oppose the previous paradigm. This leads us to the conclusion that evolution theory is not something which is immutable, something stable, something that cannot be changed. So the best way of countering any supposed theory which claims to counter Islam is to understand epistemology, as you were questioning, regarding how do we approach scientific theories. We will say our approach is scientific theory or hypothesis does not become fact until we can observe empirically with our senses, or we can deduce logically. Anything else which does not fall into this category, we will categorize it as an induced hypothesis which cannot oppose certainty. So in conclusion, the theory of evolution will not be concluded as being deductive. For instance, if Richard Dawkins came here, I will not debate him on certain scientific facts. I will debate him on the induction that he has superimposed on those scientific facts, the conclusion that he has drawn. And that is the sphere of philosophy, not the sphere of science. We do not debate observable scientific data. What we debate is the conclusion drawn from that data. So our position to modern evolution is what the position of anyone would have been towards the geocentric model prior to the heliocentric model coming along. If another model comes, does this mean we switch according to that model? Do we keep switching our beliefs according to different scientific models or different scientific paradigms? No. Mainly because the theory of evolution does have anomalies. Does any scientist deny this? Yes, there are scientists who deny that it does not have. They say it does not have any anomalies. This is not a fact. There are anomalies in any scientific theory. We as theists wait for those anomalies to be exposed, and as the process of science is puzzle solving, this will eventually lead to another paradigm shift. So paradigm shifts of scientific theories are not something that affect our beliefs, which are based on deduction, and then Based on deduction, we believe in the existence of a divine creator. Once we believe in the existence of a divine creator, we believe in divine revelation. What is the logical step that we have taken to divine revelation? That logical step is something for questions and answers. For anyone else can ask, why did we take the step from the existence of divine creator to divine revelation? But does that answer your question? No.
Yeah, the question also was about
what steps do we take?
yeah, teaching our children, our youngsters, that evolution, what they've been taught in the schools, is
How we approach that is not the way Christian creationists in America have been approaching this. Christian creationists, for instance, they believe in a young earth. They believe the earth is 7,000 years old. In Muslim sources, we find some Muslim scholars, for instance, saying the earth is 7,000 years old. If someone quotes that scholar as saying the earth is 7,000 years old, which fallacy will that fall into? Remember the fallacies? We have the fallacy of number 8, using a mistaken ijtihad of a scholar. That report of the earth being 7,000 years old is based upon an Israelite report. An Israelite report, not upon an Islamic source. So in the same way, when we tackle the theory of evolution, we are not claiming that we as theologians are tackling the theory of evolution as scientists. We are tackling the theory of evolution through the philosophy of science. How do we approach any scientific theory which is not based upon empirical observable points or deduction, except it's based upon what? Induction or a hypothesis? We approach this by teaching our congregation or children the logical method of opposing the theory of evolution of any scientific, or how to approach any scientific theory, a logical method. There are flaws in this theory of evolution, but will we be taken seriously if we point out those flaws? Again, appeal to authority. Appeal to authority is another fallacy. What is that fallacy? That someone will say, do you know more about biology, or does Richard Dawkins know more about biology? So by me quoting scientific facts to an audience, will that convince them? No, they are falling into a fallacy which is appeal to authority. Or if something is famous, does it make it true? If something is well known, does it make it true? One last point I would want to mention is how change occurs in a scientific community. Sometimes you may have a scientific community that agrees upon a given point. When an anomaly is found in a scientific theory, a person who discovers a new theory, a new paradigm, he may change the consensus of a scientific community. Once the consensus changes, the scientific position also changes, and there is a shift which occurs from one position to another. So these shifts occur every 100 years. I guarantee you, from 100 years from now, the scientific shift from modern day evolution theory will change. So we cannot accept evolution based upon those philosophical grounds. Is that clear? And how do we counter it in mosques? Is by teaching this method. Okay, are there any other questions based on that? Maybe someone would want to ask. Okay, here, if Islam isn't an invading religious movement, why did the caliphs conquer other lands? Now, remember what I said regarding jihad. Historically speaking, jihad was defensive. And yes, Muslims did conquer other lands. On what basis did they conquer those lands? On the basis of removing any threat to Muslim lands, or in order to emancipate any groups of people within those lands. This was the reason why those caliphs conquered those lands. Now anyone can cite historical sources, but they must be accurate in how they quote those historical sources. Chainless reports, for instance, are rejected. If the report has no chain, no verification method, we as Muslims reject those reports. If those reports are solitary reports, one person narrated that narration, we may reject that report depending on the method. There is a method of verification. But historically speaking, like I said earlier, I will challenge any non-Muslim or Muslim to show me where Islam was legislated purely for the reason of aggression. In fact, no one can prove this, that Islam legislated jihad purely for the purpose of aggression. This cannot be shown. If they do, they will fall into any one of the 15 fallacies that I have mentioned. 15 fallacies. I guarantee you, if there are, maybe there will be other fallacies soon that I will be able to deduce. Are there any other questions? Otherwise we will close up.
I've come here to obviously build faith stronger, so I want to find out what are your strongest arguments for a creator?
Very simply put, the existence of creation. The existence of creation shows the existence of a creator. In simple words.
Simple as that.
This is something we believe intuitively as a creator. What details relate to that is the creator eternal? Yes, he would have to be. Why? If he wasn't eternal, this would lead to regression, because then he would need a creator.
Yeah, but if I was an atheist, which I'm not, that wouldn't convince me, now, would it?
No. Remember I said at the beginning, our reason of Islamic theology is not necessarily to convert people. We are not proselytizing. We are answering any objections placed on Islam.
So I would ask you the question.
As a Muslim, for instance, if I met an atheist, I would say to him, this is Islam. You can accept or reject. He may have some objections. If his objections are fallacies, I will point out your objections are fallacies. After I point out his fallacies, he has no more objections. It's up to him to accept. We are not claiming that we're going to revert.
You said you need 100% to be a believer. But if you got that 1% or that 0.001% which you doubt, then you're a non-believer. So to build on the faith, we need evidence. Apart from just, there's a creation, there's other evidence as well. Apart from, because obviously this is the age of science. So the question was, what are your arguments for a creator?
The brother should have watched part 1 of the lecture. It deals with all these questions.
Yeah, but we'll continue from this. Look, our methods are based upon first syllogistic proof, deductive proof. For instance, the contingency of the universe shows that the universe is caused. The universe has a cause. Why do we say the universe has a cause? Because it has a contingent nature. What do we mean by contingency? We mean by contingency anything which comes into existence after non-existence. This leads us to the conclusion that the universe is caused. Everything must have a cause. If it did not have a cause, then it will lead to two other conclusions. Either the universe caused itself, came out of nothing. Will we accept this? This goes against our intuitive mind, that the universe cannot come out of nothing and the universe cannot cause itself. So the only third solution is the universe was caused. Someone may say, why did you jump to the conclusion that that cause is God? We will say that initial cause must be uncaused. Why? Because if he was caused, then that cause will also have a cause. And then that cause will also have a cause. And this will lead to regression, which is, again, a logical absurdity. So the initial cause is what we believe in the aseity of that initial cause, meaning self-subsistent cause. This cause we call God. This is a basic syllogistic argument for any atheist. Of course, they claim this syllogism is weak. The atheist claims this syllogism is weak. In response to that, we say they would have to show us, without using fallacies, that this syllogism is weak. And how we draw the conclusion from that argument to divine revelation is a different issue. Once someone accepts God, the need for divine revelation is a totally different argument, because they will say there are so many religions which are competing for one another, why will we become Muslim? That then comes into apologetics for Islam, and where we discuss specifics of Islam, specifics of the Quran, and generally speaking, these 15 fallacies are generally used to tarnish Islam, or what we call muddying the well, making the water muddy.
Ibn Khaldun and his Muqaddimah, how do we deal with those issues? Does that fall under one of the fallacies? And is he regarded as a scholar, or
yes? Ibn Khaldun is an authority in sociology. He was not an authority in theology or jurisprudence. Therefore, any positions Ibn Khaldun takes, or for instance, some people call Ibn Miskawayh for evolution, saying that he was one of the earliest people who mentioned human evolution. We will say in response to that, that the only position which is essential upon Muslims to believe is those positions which are built upon consensus. If you cite an individual scholar, it is insufficient. Again, that will fall into an appeal to authority, or using positions of a sect in some cases, or using positions of the mistake of an individual Muslim. Muslim scientists are not necessarily theologians. For instance, Ibn Sina, Avicenna, he's not necessarily a theologian. He's not a theologian. He was a philosopher. Time. Okay. جزا الله عنا سيدنا محمد صلى الله عليه وآله وسلم ما هو أهله. جزا الله عنا سيدنا محمد صلى الله عليه وآله وسلم ما هو أهله. جزا الله عنا سيدنا محمد صلى الله عليه وآله وسلم ما هو أهله. سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين.